Good evening, everyone. My name is Cal Walker, and I am your moderator for tonight's presentation from Community Faith Partners, the continuing series, Let's Talk Unity. Over the past year, Community Faith Partners has presented discussions in this virtual Zoom format covering a wide range of subjects, and we believe that the discussion tonight is among the most topical and time-sensitive. Around this country, across our state, and right here in our local community, people are not just talking about the need for change in law enforcement and other critical agencies and institutions within our communities. They are literally demanding that substantive changes are in fact made. And what that looks like is the central question. And there are people predictably in vastly different places on the spectrum of opinion. What is abundantly clear, however, is that the status quo is simply untenable. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was often quoted as saying, quote, "Change does not come rolling in on the wheels of inevitability," unquote. Change does not always occur overnight, but change can and simply must occur, and it requires everyone coming to the table and being heard. Chief Melvin Russell, who along with Mr. Elijah Grubb are our panelists this evening and will be introduced shortly, has said, quote, "So it takes all of us. And when I say community, I'm talking about everything that makes up a community." And I'm sure he will expand on that tonight. Speaking of tonight, tonight's focus is on reimagining policing. It requires honest dialogue between law officers and the broader community. Consistent with our established format with this series, there will be questions posed to our panelists, followed by question and answer opportunities for you, the audience. Community Faith Partners is happy to foster caring, honest, and relevant conversation that causes us to rethink our norm. CFP would like to thank their donors for making Let's Talk Unity possible and give special thanks to Dermatology Associates of Ithaca and the Park Foundation, who helped fund Community Faith Partners' Racial Justice Initiative. And to you, the audience that's tuned in tonight, thank you for joining us for what I'm sure you will agree is a pertinent discussion. Now, as we typically do, we're going to open in prayer. Lord God, we come before you with praise and thanksgiving, recognizing that according to your word, this is the day that you have made, and we rejoice and are glad in it. So God, we gather around tonight to engage in very serious conversation, listening, dialogue, and opportunity to engage actively in this conversation. We commend this time to you, Lord, for we are about serious business. We are about the business of justice, and we know from having read your word that you are a God of justice. And so, Lord, we thank you for all those who have tuned in tonight. We thank you for the panelists who have so graciously volunteered of their time to engage in this meaningful conversation. We thank you, Lord, and ask your blessings upon our time together. Amen. So now I would like to introduce you to our panelists tonight. Melvin T. Russell is Chief of the Community Partnership Division, Baltimore Police Department. He joined that department in 1979 as a police cadet and graduated from the BPD Academy in 1981 as the first and only African-American class valedictorian. He worked both as a uniform patrol, then as an undercover officer for 20 years before re-emerging as an Eastern District Lieutenant in 2007. In this position, he turned the worst midnight patrol shift in the city into the best in a 3-month period and was promoted to Major of the Eastern District 11 months later. It was during this time as Major that he created the nonprofit Transformation Team, a grassroots organization of community shareholders that are committed to working together to make a better Baltimore. In January 2013, Russell was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and created the Community Partnership Division. You can view his very popular TED Talk, Melvin T. Russell TED Talk, and I believe that that is going to be put in the chat tonight for your convenience. Thank you, Chief Mel, for joining us tonight.
Cal, thank you. It's just a pleasure to be here with you and the rest of the family.
Elijah Grubb is part of the leadership team at the Vineyard Church of Ithaca, New York. Before moving to this area, he served in the United States Air Force as an Arabic linguist and subsequently completed degrees in biblical languages and theology. He has been employed as a law enforcement officer since 2014, during which time he has served as a patrolman and most recently as a member of a full-time tactical team. Elijah, we're so happy to have you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal. Very excited to be here. Also especially honored to be here with Chief Mel. Yeah, I feel like I'm sitting at the feet of Paul. You know, he has this amazing bio, and then it's like, and Elijah's here and he's a cop. So yeah, it's a huge honor to be participating in this with you, Chief Mel, and I just thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, I'll pay you later.
You know what? I just met you guys last night, actually, and just feel so connected to you and just so delighted to have you all with us tonight. So we're going to jump right into, I'm going to ask you an introductory question so that folks get a better sense of who you are. And then we're going to jump right into the heart of this discussion that we need to have tonight. So let me start with you, Chief Mel. What is your story and why have you devoted your career to law enforcement?
Well, I'll try to be really brief because, you know, almost 40 years in law enforcement. I came in at the tender age of 19, but you should know, and the audience should know, that it was my secondary choice as a career. My first choice was actually being in oceanography, marine biology. And but long story short, I screwed up my eardrums doing something I had no business doing in college. And so I fell back on my second career choice, which actually the door was opened by a patrolman, a foot patrolman. So a lot of people want to see more foot patrolmen. They definitely do make a difference in our communities. And he came through the community where I was doing some light work and said, hey, go down to the police department. And the rest is history. I joined as a cadet at the tender age of 19. You can't be a police officer until you're 21. I went through the academy at 20 and a half, became the first African-American to actually graduate, as you mentioned, class valedictorian. Really, there hasn't been a black male that's done it since, and that's actually a shame. 2 women have done it, but not another black male. And I'm not proud of that fact. Spent my time in patrol for a couple of years, got bit by the drug bug, fell in love with that. So I went into undercover narcotic work for 20 years, and that work took me all over the country, all over the world. But where my challenge or my transformation really happened was when I exited narcotics and came back into patrol after 20-year absence and saw the stark difference of how policing was being done when I was part of that patrolling back in the 80s. And now here we are, 2007, and was quite a different beast. It was quite a different animal. It was not the same. There was a trust breach. There was so much going on. And I knew I had to get to work. The God in me told me that now I'm allowing you to see things. You got to get to work, brother.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much. You have whet the audience's appetite for much more to come. And we're going to be jumping right into the heart of that in just a moment. Elijah, what is your story and why have you devoted your career to law enforcement?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in rural Vermont. It kind of fit the bill of what you would call a homogenous culture. I don't think I knew a black child growing up. And when I was 19, I entered the Air Force, served 4 years, and I got out of the Air Force with a desire to teach theology. So I attended a 4-year Bible college, and then I entered a graduate program in theology with the goal of eventually earning my PhD and teaching at the university level. During my first year of graduate study, I had had an existential crisis that had begun to develop in my undergraduate days, and this climaxed in my graduate studies. And so I found myself not only doubting my faith, but really doubting my even reason for studying theology. So I decided to bail ship. And here I am with, at this point, a wife and 2 kids. And all I have to show for vocational credentials are a couple of theology degrees and no faith. So that rules out ministry. So I have no idea how I'm going to support my family. And long story short, I ultimately decided on a career in law enforcement. I can't say that there was this great sense of calling. It was rather at that point more of a sense of necessity and something that I knew I could do from my military days and kind of my experience with the government. So I entered police academy on August 4th, 2014. And if that date sounds familiar, it's because about 1 week later, I'm sitting in class when we're informed that protests have erupted in response to the death of a black man named Michael Brown, who was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, obviously, this isn't the first time, right, that there's been tensions between police and communities of color. But as a brand new, newly sworn police officer, I all of a sudden find myself thrust into the center, so to speak, of this conversation in a way that I wasn't quite anticipating. So over the next few years in law enforcement, this is kind of what brings me to the conversation today. I participated in what I would call two religious organizations that began to shape my desires to be here today. And the first of these organizations I participated in, it was a robust discipleship program, or it had a robust discipleship program, right? And so I was learning what it was to be a good follower, a good disciple of this way. So for example, I learned about their holy law, their code of ethics that included principles like loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. I became part of a family in which I had brothers and sisters that I was not only willing to die for, but even to kill for. And of course, this religious organization I'm speaking about is the police. Now, at the same time, I also became part, again, of another religious organization, and that is the church, right? At this time, God began to restore my faith again, and I began to be rediscipled in the way of Jesus. And as I participated in this community, I began to sense certain tensions between the discipleship I was experiencing as a cop and the discipleship I was experiencing as a Christian. And so ultimately, because of this tension and because of the fact that I want to my Christian discipleship to dictate the terms of my law enforcement discipleship, that's ultimately what drew me into this conversation and why I'm so excited to be here today.
Wow. Thank you both again for sharing that. Those insights help us to have a broader sense beyond your introductory bios, and we certainly appreciate that. So look, as I said, we're going to jump feet first right into this. You know, we're gonna hop off the diving board right on the deep end. We are talking about reimagining policing. Folks are talking about that all over the country. And so let me pose a very direct question to both of you, beginning with you, Chief Merrill. Does the history of policing in America legitimately lend itself to restructuring, or will this simply become a failed attempt in 2 to 3 years?
Well, thank you for that, Cal. This is probably where I'm going to spend the most of my time talking. Then I'm going to get off of this. I won't be long-winded on any other things. I don't think so. But I think I need to go back in order to make my answer make sense. We need to understand that policing started in colonial America and really started in Boston in 1636. And they formulated some semblance of a police department. It had some part-time employees and mostly had volunteers. And it was basically to keep the community safe. They were made up of community members. And back then it was big in prostitution and gambling. So that's why it was started. And then in 1658, New York followed suit. But it wasn't a very efficient system. It just didn't take well. The modern policing organizations didn't come along until many years later, around 1845, and Boston did that, and then New York, and Baltimore followed suit too in there around, and I'm from Baltimore, so 1857. So that's when Baltimore followed suit, and it began to start shaping some things. But at the same time, I mean, they all had similar characteristics. They were talking about, listen, first of all, policing was supported by public, or not public, but bureaucracy, but also public support. Officers were full-time now employees, no longer volunteers. Departments had rules and regulations they put in place, and police officers was continuously being hired. So it became a system, and it was governed by your local authorities, a mayor, city council president, whatever the case may be. But unfortunately, and this is what a lot of people know and don't like about policing, neither do I, The southern states took a different path. The southern states started practicing policing as a form of slave patrol. And that's what we hear a lot about. So that started in down in South, and it really started in the Carolinas. And these guys were just coming together as policemen, but they were really just slave patrols to return slaves to their owners when they ran away. They were there to figure out how to punish slaves, to stop them from running away. And then finally, after the Civil War, we know that eventually we were freed as slaves, but then they introduced something called Jim Crow's law. So that was then segregated or put into place. And so now they began to use these horrific laws to still police us in a way of being slave patrols. But for me, and this is where I need to go, the father of modern policing is Sir Robert Peel. We need to know that because he's the hero in this story. And even though he's over in London, he started and created the Metropolitan Police Department in London, and it was so powerful, and that was 1829, that those principles that he came up with, you can look it up, 9 basic principles, are so powerful that they still use them today, not just in America, but around the world in democratic places, where democracy is strong. And so what I love about policing, the history of policing, it got it right when you're talking about Sir Robert Peel, because he talked about things like, what did he want? He said, there needs to be impact and there needs to be emphasis on community policing. This is in the 1800s. So Robert Peel said it must be community policing. The police must be the public and the public must be the police. We must protect life and property. We have to engage the community, gain community trust, prevent crime, and we can't have any force beyond what is necessary to make an arrest. This is him in 1829. So he had all these wonderful principles in place, but then all of a sudden, now let's fast forward. The history of policing. Something awful happened to policing in the 90s. It happened in the 90s, where New York began to do something called zero tolerance policing. It got away from those 9 principles that were solid, and it began to say the only way we can fix crime in our city is to arrest our way out. New York did it. It had some success, and so most metropolitan cities across the country now practice this zero tolerance policing, and it's the worst thing that happened to policing, and it's never been checked. And that's why today we now hear people saying we need to rethink, reimagine policing. We don't need to reimagine. We just need to go back to the foundation of policing that Sir Robert Peel put in place, because we don't do it anymore. What we do now is arrest, arrest, arrest. We protect and overprotect, and we don't serve our community. When Robert Peel said that is a foundational piece, you must be part of the community. You must serve the community, protect the community, and we got away from that. And the problem and the challenges today, and I'll start with this, is most of our leaders that lead police departments today, they weren't around in policing when there was community policing, when I came up. So now you got leaders across the country trying to figure out, oh, we can't say zero tolerance anymore, but we must say community policing, but I don't know what that looks like. I didn't experience that. I was a little boy when that was happening. I just happened to be an old head, so I was around when it was happening, and I was a police and came under some great police that did community policing. So you don't have to really rethink it, reimagine it. You just need to take it back to when it wasn't broken, when it was fixed. Look at Sir Robert Peel. Look at his principles, and if we can fix things if we do that.
Wow, Chief Merrill, that was a lot to digest, and thank you for putting out there. And I want to say to the audience, I want to remind you, put your questions in the chat, because we're going to pose some questions to these gentlemen, but by all means, go ahead and start populating that chat with your questions, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can. And I'm sure that there's going to be some questions related to some of the things that Chief Miller just said. I'll have a follow-up in just a moment as well. So Elijah, let me pose that question to you, the very same question. Does the history of policing in America lend itself to restructuring, or will it simply become a failed attempt in 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, so I'm going to come from a little bit of a different angle than Chief Mel, but don't take what I say as disagreement. I actually largely agree, and I'm just going to play with words here a little differently. So if I had to answer the question in a word, right, yes or no, I would say yes. Right now, thankfully, I get to expand on that. And I don't have to stick with yes or no. Now, right now in policing, from what I can tell, there's basically 3 movements, right? So the first, you could say, are the reformers. And that would be kind of what Chief Mel just pointed to, right? Policing has its problems, but it can be reformed largely by getting back to the good roots, right? That policing has inherently in it some visions that are good. And if we actually stick to those, we can police well, right? This is most people that work in the criminal justice system are going to argue for some kind of reform. Then today you hear a lot about the defund movement. But from what I can tell, the defund movement largely consists of really two movements. The more conservative wing of it could really be called a reallocate movement, right? Because what it's about is reallocating some funding that currently goes to policing to other sectors of public service like mental health, education, or drug rehabilitation. So it says we need to shrink police so we have more funds freed up to invest in the community in other ways. Then you have the more progressive end of the defund movement, which argues for the abolition of the police. Right? And these folks actually argue that policing is so inherently abusive and oppressive that the only way to correct the injustices in our society is to completely abolish it. Now, to get back to our question, in my opinion, the strongest argument from these folks is the historical one. And as Chief Mel alluded to, right, if you look at the history of policing in America, you see things like slave patrols. You see violent suppression of worker movements. You see things like Texas Rangers killing indigenous populations or driving them off their land. You see suppression of civil rights. And most recently, you see police literally kneeling on the neck of George Floyd until he died. Now, from that perspective, from that angle, it seems reasonable and perhaps just to conclude that we just have to do away with the whole thing, right? This is rotten to the core. We can't restructure, we can't reform, we have to abolish. And this is kind of taking a broad philosophical approach. But the problem, it seems to me, is that at its root, policing is simply that sector of government that is authorized to use coercive force. Now, I'm not saying that right is all that police should do, but at its core, that is what police exists for. And when seen from this angle, while modern policing, right, things like slave patrols are in some sense new, the abuse associated with policing is not new at all. It's one of the oldest stories we know, right? Think of the story of the exodus of the Jews, or how about the Roman Empire? In the Roman Empire, you had a public official called the mansept, whose job was to torture slaves on behalf of their owner if they got out of line. You could take your slave to a facility where they had devices that were at your disposal to torture them if they got out of line. This was a public service position. If we direct our gaze away from ancient empires or nation states and onto tribal societies, we don't have to look hard to find the same kind of abuses of power. Now, what is my point in saying all this? It's simply this. The function of policing, right, is inherent to the idea of government itself. So the more radical segment that talks about completely abolishing policing, you have to basically go the route of anarchism, right? If we accept the fact that one of the state's primary responsibilities is the bearing of the sword, then the choice is basically between anarchism or some kind of police. Now, how does that relate? Well, I think reform and reimagining then is an imperative, right? It's an imperative. Our history in America testifies to potential abuse, but I want to suggest that it also testifies to great potential for reform, for restructuring. And I think if you listen to Chief Mel's bio right at the beginning, what he was able to do in Baltimore actually testifies to that when policing is done right, it can make changes for the good. So to the second part, right, will our current efforts fail in 2 to 3 years? I don't know, maybe, right? The issues we're dealing with in society are really complex. And we might get it wrong, at least in some areas. But reimagining policing, I want to suggest, or reforming, if you want to use that term, is not something we do once. Rather, it's something that every generation that lives in a just society has to commit themselves to. So speaking more specifically to Christians, I would suggest that it's part and parcel of the Christian mission. And I'm just going to finish my answer here with a brief quote from one of my favorite political theologians, a guy by the name of Oliver O'Donovan. He says this, quote, "The church does not philosophize about a future world. It demonstrates the working of the coming kingdom within this one. Through the authorization of the Holy Spirit, it squares up to civil authority and confronts it. This may lead to martyrdom or to mutual service. I want to suggest that the Black church has testified to that reality for a long time in America, testified to the reality of being willing to accept martyrdom for the sake of justice, or to cooperatively work with the government for the sake of justice, as Chief Mel has done. And I want to suggest that it's time that the Church Universal in America actually joins them and we start working together. Thanks.
I want to I want to just comment on something here. You made the statement, if I'm not mistaken, that to abolish policing would inevitably, and I'm paraphrasing here, lead to either anarchy. That must, you said anarchy, or some form of policing has to be in place. In the absence of police, some form of policing, there would be anarchy. Is that the way you stated it?
Yeah, that's my contention.
Okay, right. And so I would just simply say that there are those who would support the who would contend that no, anarchy is not the alternative to not having police, but what they would perhaps argue is that rather than saying you're either going to have anarchy or some form of policing, they might say you may have anarchy if you don't have some form of justice prioritized public safety. You see what I'm saying? And they may call it different things. And so I'm not here to argue one position or the other. But it's a pretty definitive statement to say that in the absence of policing, because people can only envision policing as they experience it in contemporary times. And I think that at least what I have read and what I have tended to hear is that people are saying, look, there must be some form in any civilized society of some prioritized justice-based response to unlawful behavior within communities. And as I understand it, the concept of reimagining what that looks like may or may not involve what is typically referred to as policing. And so, again, I just think that in the interest of trying to provide a little bit of balance, I think that there would be some contention around the absence of policing in and of itself would lead to anarchy within a society. But you know what? We'll see how that gets fleshed out in the discussion as it goes forward. You know, it's interesting. Chief Mel, you have a very popular TED Talk, and when I listen to it, you know, with TED Talk, other topics come up. And there was one from a gentleman, Charles Ramsey. I don't know if you happen to know that gentleman, but one of the things he said, he posed a rhetorical question, and he's been in police, in law enforcement for about 47 years. And one of the things he said is, what if the role of policing was not simply, quote, to enforce the laws, but rather, quote, to protect the constitutional rights of all its citizens? And that's a very interesting question. And I would love to hear or read, you know, how people might digest and dissect that and move it forward as part of the public discourse. Let me remind the audience that you are encouraged to put questions and comments in the chat. I'm going to move on to the third question. Very often, and I'm going to pose this one to you first, Elijah. Very often we hear that police departments offer, quote, diversity training. However, some feel that it hasn't moved the needle toward a more equitable policing for all citizens. And the question is a rather point blank one. Why has diversity training seemed to fail for the most part?
Yeah, so I'm going to once again do the theology thing because that's what I love. And I'm going to answer this question by posing a different issue. Okay, so if I ask, like by show of hands, if you want, you can raise your hands. How many of us would admit that we are in some way complicit in the sin of overconsumption, right? I certainly would, right? We consume more than we need. And because of that, we share in the blame for all of the woes that are associated with overconsumption. Now, If you can admit that you participate in this problem of overconsumption, then a follow-up question would be, is it because you don't think it's a problem, right? Do you overconsume because you actually think it's the right thing to do? Or is it in spite of the fact that you think it's wrong? I suspect for most of us, it's probably in spite of the fact that we think overconsumption is wrong, that we find ourselves still doing so. Now, I want to suggest that the problem is that we inhabit a culture in which we're discipled from a young age to overconsume. Now, the question is, if we're over-consuming in spite of the fact that we think it's wrong because of this discipleship process, how do we change that? Well, what if I told you that I would preach a sermon to you about once a year on the issue, right? But even though I'm going to preach a sermon once a year on overconsumption, understand that I'm not going to change anything else about the culture in my church. And it just so happens that in my church, everyone likes to dress in the latest fashions. They all like to eat out every Sunday. And the pastor drives a Lamborghini because we think the pastor should be compensated well. You think that one sermon a year would produce change in the area of overconsumption? It might, right? It might produce some change, especially for people who really listen attentively. But I doubt it would produce much, either deep change for anyone or certainly widespread change. Now, what if instead I suggested that in addition to the one sermon a year, we're going to restructure our church to model the simplicity that Jesus himself lived? What if I said that we're going to begin, for example, to fast regularly and to give generously? What if I said I want you to give away all of your discretionary income to charity? And in addition, on those days that you fast, I want you to give the money you save on food to charity. Don't you think that would do a lot more to change our attitudes and our practices of overconsumption? In my experience, and I suspect Chief Mel will resonate this, though I don't know his context, but in my experience, diversity training that exists in police departments basically represents the first approach. And I work for an agency that is probably fairly progressive by modern standards, right? We basically take online training once a year to teach about diversity in a subculture which otherwise embraces numerous subconscious disciplines and practices that serve to undermine the very thing that we are stating in our once a year training is important. Now, until we work to actually change the culture of policing, and I have some ideas of how I could do this, but until we work to actually change that culture and the daily practices that we inhabit, the diversity training at best will have marginal effect, at best. That's my answer in brief.
And Chief Merrill, I'm going to pose this question to you in just a minute, but Elijah, that's very interesting, and we certainly appreciate you saying that. So, there's an old operational organizational maxim that says that organizations or systems are perfectly designed to get the results they get, whether those results are good or whether those results are bad. And so I guess, people might ask, well, given what you have said, this once a year mandated training, online, whatever it is, if that is the system that this is being delivered in, and is getting the net results that you've articulated, the question becomes, well, what if it's clearly not working, it's only being done once a year, is it being done to check off a box? And what message does that send, right? Because people have to know that the results that are ostensibly, talked about as being the desired results from these kinds of trainings, feedback loops and actions and attitudes and various other things ought to be some very strong indication that, hey, folks, this ain't working well. And so the question becomes, if there's a real commitment to those outcomes that perhaps the diversity or sensitivity trainings or whatever people want to call them was designed for, folks will say, okay, how come it's not being improved? Why is it only being done once a year? What are the metrics to determine the efficacy of it all? And if what you're doing is not working, why not try something different? Do you understand where I'm going with this? Because then
Yes.
people begin to question motives, right? I mean, how invested are you as an and I don't mean you, of course, but how invested is the institution of policing in real change, if at best something is being done once a year with marginal, questionable, or nil effect, that people would argue. So I think it's in part those types of things that cause a lot of people to wonder and to question whether uh, legitimately these systems can be depended upon to affect the kind of changes that are absolutely necessary, to go forward. So, just an observation. Chief Mel, I want to pose that same question to you. Shall I repeat it?
No, no, no. You listen. You and Elijah hit some nails on the head. You're both bringing valid points that need to be addressed. Uh, Listen, diversity is necessary wherever there's a diverse people, right? That's dwelling in the same space, common space. You have to believe in diversity, right? It can't be about one culture. It can't be us versus them. In order to be effective, you've got to learn of one another. And so I will say, I will piggyback and co-sign what Elijah said about the one once a year in service training. And you said, Cal, which was a nail on the head, was it is exactly that, in my humble opinion, that it is simply leaders have understood that for years, the general public has been crying out, you better get some sensitivity training, some diversity training. And because they can't push back against that, because we're supposed to serve, right? Then it is simply a checking of the box. We will bring somebody in to train us to do that so we can then articulate and say, oh no, we get trained in that arena. But I'm going to tell you, a simple class on diversity, one day out of the year, not 1 day out of the year, 1 hour out of the entire year, right, is hardly a bandage upon a gaping wound that exists, right? It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. But if leaders are given a pass in law enforcement and government, and we can say, okay, they said they're getting a diverse training, so we good now, then we're not going to dig any deeper. Leaders aren't going to go any further because all they want is that pass. Does this satisfy your outcry? Look, we are training. But no, there has to be some immersion in that, right? We have got to get to the place where leaders in law enforcement, regardless of what they want to do to protect their paradigm, right? We have got to get to a place to say, this is a diverse community. This is a diverse world, and it's getting more diverse United States by the day, right? That's why Jesus said, we have to learn to love one another. It didn't say just love other police. He didn't say Christians, just learn Christians. My God, he was so radical that he said, you better even learn to love your enemies, right? Now, Paul, if we remember, Paul had to rebuke Peter for coming into the church of Athens that he started. Because Peter was one way with one group and another way with another group, right? He wasn't instant in season and out of season, right? And Paul says, wait a minute, I got a diverse church over here. And if you won't come here and just preach what is good for the Jews and how the Gentiles are bad, no, first of all, you got it wrong. You missed the message of Jesus. And number two, you will not come back and preach in this church because we believe in diversity, right? And that's what we're doing in law enforcement. We're taking that one class, we're being able, and we're shoving it down the community's voice. And Elijah, you said it so wonderfully. When you talk about I can't remember exactly how eloquent you talked about it, but the overindulgence. And this is an area that we do have to overindulge. We have to immerse ourselves. This is an area where we have to say, you know what? We don't have all the answers. We've been getting it wrong for a long time. The community knows it. And now we got to be so transparent and humble enough to say, we need help. We need professionals to come in and come alongside of us, right? We need those mental health practitioners. We've got PSD going on. We got trauma in our communities, not just the community that we've traumatized, which we have, but now we're traumatized, right? And we can't even get help because it's unacceptable. We get ostracized to say we need help. We're peace officers, but we don't even have peace. So we're not even giving ourselves the diverse training that we need to be effective peace officers. So we got it wrong. And until we as a people can really push the agenda and say, tell us how you are diversifying your department. Because I've literally seen departments, including my own, bring in a so-called expert to teach one class to commanders and say, now you are diversified. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. This is crazy, right? I mean, a book that I read a long time ago, and I'll shut up with this, said it takes at least 21 days to change a habit. At least 21 days. How in the world am I going to change my stinking thinking in 1 hour of training? Man, I'm flushing that so quick and I'm going back to what I do, and I'm going to still continue to treat the public the way I do. I've got to learn to immerse myself with the community that I serve and become part of that community, because there's nothing better than on-the-job training. But anyway, I'm going to shut up. Go ahead, Cal.
No, listen, you all are doing exactly what we had hoped tonight. And let me say to the audience, I have made a cardinal mistake as a moderator. I gave you a wrong directive. I said, put your questions in the chat. What I should have said is put your questions in the Q&A. So my bad. Hopefully you all have figured that out and putting your questions in the Q&A, and we're going to be getting to those very, very shortly. You know, Chief Mel, Elijah, you all have just pointed out some things that I think a lot of people say, well, you know, see, that is strengthening our argument for external push to change law enforcement. Because if you've got leadership that is signing off on the checking of the boxes and not ensuring or being committed to transformational change, that is where the mistrust on the part of the public really emanates from and gets strengthened. Because, you know, I think a lot of people would say that there's a collective, there's a growing sense that there is not the collective will of leadership within law enforcement at national and local levels to require the kind of change that people talk about. The checking of a box obviously does not change attitudes, does not change culture, it does not change climate. Those things are measurable, right? And if you don't see net results and people continue, as Chief Mel said, to get a pass, is there any wonder that many in the public simply do not trust the institution to fix itself? And so again, that really, you know, gets back to, and we don't necessarily have to go back to the question of you know, whether policing can be fixed internally or can be changed internally. But that, I think, is the question that continues to come up, and the more anecdotal type things that people read about, hear about, and conclude, ultimately it becomes a failure, in my opinion, a collective failure of leadership and a settling of a status quo while giving the appearance that something actionable is happening. And people are tired of an illusion. People are looking for real substantive change. And how that happens, again, as I said at the very outset here, that is yet to be determined. It's going to be determined by collective community input with everybody at the table. But, you know, it is absolutely transparent to the public that there is a lack of accountability for not box checking, but for results. And that is simply what people are demanding.
Do you want a brief response to that, Cal?
Go ahead, sure.
So I think I agree with you, right? I agree that I totally understand why there's skepticism, especially in light of this. But I think the problem is the naivety, is that society is so much different than the police. I think we're all sick. And the problem is, if you were to transplant every cop and put somebody with a different vision in there, unless you completely rethought the things that form us from the ground up, and particularly instituted ways, right? Create institutional measures to help us remain compassionate and kind and to appreciate the other. I think your most progressive type would fall into the same patterns of policing. Good people become cops and end up changed over time. It's not as if I'm saying like there's a lot of bad people in cops. I know a lot of fantastic people that are deeply committed, but I think policing is simply a representation of where we are at as a society.
Let me just follow up with what he's saying. He's absolutely correct. A lot of police come into the field wanting to do the right thing, but here's where your problem is: leadership. Now, I was a leader, and I know because I fought against this my entire career, especially in my last 12 years in command. Most leaders are transactional leaders. What have you done for me lately? Right? What you want to have in place, especially at the top of the food chain, are transformational, like you mentioned earlier, transformational leaders. So they can look beyond tomorrow. They can see what the city's going to look like in a year and stick to that plan and not be moved by every whim and fire that pops up. Stick to the core plan, because we know that when you stick to a core plan, you're going to meet resistance anyway. That's just what the devil does. He comes against us. I can't tell you how many times I've been on the path of doing the right thing and people try to shut us down, and it seemed like that'd be the right thing to do, but we kept the course and we finally broke through and transformation happened time and time again. But that's difficult to be a leader like that. And the problem is cops will follow the leader. What is the mindset and the spirit of the leader? What are you pushing down in your organization? If you're being pushed on data, if you're being pushed on quotas, if you're being pushed on all kind of nonsense, and you're not even contemplating of serving the community, loving on the community, oh my God, boy, that's soft police work. We don't do that no more. You need to go back to the 80s. You need to go back to the 70s. We don't do that no more. And so if you get in that framework, you come as a cop who wants to protect and serve, and they take away from you the ability to serve because saying you're doing too much soft stuff. Go get me more guns. Go get me more bad guys. Because you mentoring a child out in the community, you turning a gang member life around, that ain't doing nothing for me. When it all matters, there's got to be a balance. And that's why I say probably one of the quickest way to fix policing in America, I wish they were all like sheriffs. Most sheriffs have to be elected into office. Police top cops are appointed by a system that doesn't believe in the type of policing that we want to have. Because it's the whole thing. I'm not going to say the whole thing is corrupt, but there's so many holes in it that they don't care about the general population, especially the poor and brown, black, brown, yellow, even white communities. You don't vote for me anyway. Why should I serve you? So they just take care of the things that's going to, listen, we are a selfish nation. How is my leadership going to benefit me? Not how can I benefit the people that I'm serving? So I'm telling you, and this is for everybody in America, look at your leadership. And if they are transactional and not transformational, you got a problem.
And those problems are glaring. And again, I think that the things that both of you all have said, quite frankly, for a lot of folks, simply reinforce the fact that for that system with that entrenched kind of leadership, where, as Elijah said, folks can come in wanting to do the right thing, but, and my words, not yours, Elijah, essentially get absorbed into or grafted into a culture that is antithetical to that which they know to be right. That is just, if that is the system that exists, you're asking, well, not you individually, but it's being asked, it's almost an impossible ask to say to the general public, but we can change ourselves.
Okay.
We can change ourselves.
Can't do it.
It is a bitter pill that people are no longer being duped into swallowing.
Good.
And so, I think that those are the realities. And gentlemen, let me just say this. I personally, and I'm sure this audience absolutely appreciates your transparency, right? And honest conversation is what is absolutely needed in order to create systems that are underpinned with justice and respect for human dignity. And the forces that have radically altered policing over the years, that thing is out of the bottle, so to speak. And there are a lot of people are saying you can't push that genie back in, so to speak. And so that's why people are looking at radical alternatives. And again, community by community, people are demanding something different. We all know it. I mean, you all can finish this next phrase I'm going to say. If you keep doing what you're doing, you're simply going to get what? More of what you got. And folks are saying enough is enough. We're not having this anymore. And so, that's why, I mean, this is an enlightening conversation. I'm not, I'm here to just kind of move a dialogue along, and we haven't even gotten to some of the questions yet, but we're going to get to those in just a second here. But, these are the things that make this conversation so incredibly contentious across the country. And, well, anyway, let us move on. There's another question. Let me get to the next couple of questions, and then we're going to jump right into the Q&A. So this time I'm going to start with you, Chief Mel. You've had a very broad amount of experience. You've served at different levels, rank and file level, leadership levels, and so on. And so from your perspective, and you've already touched on some of this, as I say, I'm right here in upstate New York now, and our local community is dealing with issues around policing, around public safety, broader than just a focus on policing. And my question to you is, from your vantage point, Chief Mel, what specific suggestions might you offer to not only our local police department, but obviously others as well, from your many years of experience? And again, you've already touched on some of those things, but I just wanted to make this question a little bit more concrete.
Yeah. So first of all, I didn't know where Ithaca was, so so I had to read up on that. And thank you, Elijah, for sending me an article. So I feel like I know a little bit about Ithaca than I did before. And I think you have a good mayor up there from what I've read. Haven't met him, haven't spoke to him, and this is nothing to go against him, but I will say I've never been a component of defunding. And Elijah said something earlier that I have been a huge component of, and that's reallocating funds. Baltimore Police Department has an over $500 million fund, and it's the largest budget in the city, as most law enforcement agencies are. But it's all about what we can do for our agency. What new toys can we buy? And I've always said, listen, when I was a chief of the community component, I was the only chief in the entire department. There was about 6 chiefs, colonels, and I was the only one who didn't have an operational budget. And so everything that I did, and it was all about, for me, serving the community at every level, I had to go out and raise funds. If it wasn't for organizations like the Ravens, the Orioles, Johns Hopkins Hospital, churches, other charity organizations, to be able to sow into the vision I had to help serve the city, I wouldn't be able to did half the stuff I was able to do, probably none of it, actually, to tell you the truth. And so I would say, number one, think about really reallocating funds, because police departments across this country need to learn to understand we don't have all the answers. And even the good word tells us that we all have in part, not in the whole.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be many members of one body. If we're one city, one township, that means there's many pieces, and not one entity has all the answers. And that means there has to be some connectivity. There has to be some collaboration. And we as law enforcement have to get out of our way and understand that I need the help of my mental health institutions and my health providers. I need the help of my drug rehabilitation programs. I need the help of my grassroots organizations, my nonprofit organizations that are doing great work. We need to come alongside of them. I was able to build out a lot of things because I understood that. I was able to build out a chaplaincy, not chaplains for police. God knows we had enough of them, but chaplains for the city, both police and community, because we're in this together. And because we had no academy, and they've been in existence since the 70s, I built an academy for them to teach them not all about policing, but about all the things that matter in our city: trauma care, trauma informed, right? Mental health issues that were going on that our cops didn't know. And then put those, after they learned all those things, put them in the car with your most challenged officers. And I mean the ones that didn't know how to engage the community. There are all kinds of things you can do to tailor make to your community. Extend that olive branch. You know what? Extend it over to the other side. And what do I mean by, because I'm talking about your detractors. Nobody wants to talk to their detractors, But you ever thought about coming together and sitting down and breaking bread and find some commonalities and begin to work together? Even the lawbreakers. I've sat down with more gang members and more people breaking the law to the root cause, was able to help them, and then they turned their lives around and ended up helping a city. So there's so many things we have to do, but at the bottom line, I'm just saying this: we've got to look beyond our own selfish needs, our own selfish agenda, and understand diversity is the way, and we have to come together. And the only way you're going to do that is come together, sit down, talk about it. First and foremost, listen and understand each other's positioning, and then come to a happy medium, and then start working together. You can heal any city. You can heal. I mean, even we live in a country now that even our churches are divided. Our churches are divided. I know Baptist churches that won't even talk to each other because they do things a little bit different. It is ridiculous. I don't think God could be so happy with us the way we operate ourselves. And so I just think it's all about diversity. It's all about coming together in the spirit of love, because that is the greatest thing we can do. There's hope. There's love, faith, and love. And the greatest one is what? Love. And so we learn to come together in love, in the spirit of love, and just talk. Some of my best friends are Black, they're white, they're Asians, they're Indians, and some of my greatest advocates and people that I love so much when I was working in those streets were even on the other side of the fence. Learn to love everybody, because people won't care anything about you until you show that you care about them. It's so easy. Stop doing it the old stinking way. Policing has lost its way. Help right the wrong. We need to get back on track. And that is understanding it's just not our ship. It's a fellowship. All of us need to be on that ship for public safety in our communities. And that doesn't mean you as a community member go out and arrest bad guys. But we have a role to play also as community members. And if we all do our part, we can fix any city in this country. Anyway, that's all I got to say.
Amen. Amen. I'm going to go to you in just a moment, Elijah. Chief Merrill, as I watched your TED Talk, listened to your TED Talk, there was one point, we were just talking about churches and ministers and so on and so forth. There was one point at which you mentioned about the clergy riding with police officers. Remember that piece?
Yes.
Now, was that something you were maybe suggesting, or is that something you all did at some point in Baltimore?
No, we did that. I thought, for those that don't know, I'm also an assistant pastor. And when I started this walk, I was a minister, and God began to deal with me. And actually, a lot of the wonderful initiatives we came up with, I can't take credit. God had the audacity to wake me up at 3 a.m. and download great things into my head. But anyway, with that said, that's something he gave me. He said, put pastors in your cars with your cops that are abusing your community and train them. And I started scouring the country for best practices and didn't see a whole lot of that going on. I found 2 good examples, one coming out of Philly and another coming out of Tennessee. I'm trying to think which city it was. That's a shame. But anyway, and so we built our own academy. I started my own academy, trained them, put them in the car. And sure enough, these cops who were hardcore, they didn't like people in the car with them. They thought they were spies for me. And but by and by, they fell in love with these chaplains who were highly trained and learned to listen more and talk less. And it got to the point where they asked these chaplains, hey, they never taught me how to deal with a suicide person who jump off a bridge. Can you help me with this? And they said, do you want me to handle it? The chaplain, you want me to handle it? Please? And they brought the person in. I've seen them negotiate hostage situations. They've done all kind of incredible stuff and won the applause of the police and the community. Going to the jail to visit, cops don't go to jail to visit a loved one's person that got locked up, but these chaplains were doing that and coming back and reporting because the parents was too afraid or too ashamed to go to the jail. So the chaplains did it and came back and gave reports, said your son's doing good. And so that's what I mean, collaboration. There's so much we can all do coming together. So no, that wasn't something I was just talking about. We had the largest chaplaincy in the nation before I had to leave. We had over 200 chaplains, and nobody in the country had more chaplains than that.
Thank you for sharing that. I thought the audience would certainly benefit from hearing that. It was one of the many, many things you say in your TED Talk. And again, that TED Talk link I think is being put in the chat for those of you who might want to access it. So Elijah, let me ask a question. You're right here in the Tompkins County community. Would you like to share your thoughts on the Reimagining Public Safety initiative has been put forth here in Ithaca. And I specifically, I think I've got the right term. In fact, I know I've got the right term. It is titled Reimagining Public Safety, recognizing that policing is just part of the bigger of a larger whole, a greater whole, because there are certainly many other organizations or institutions within this community where a change certainly needs to take place in a substantial kind of way. So again, my question to you is, being a local here, would you care to share your thoughts on the Reimagining Public Safety Initiative?
Sure. Just very briefly, too, just to echo what Chief Mel said, this summer I was in a few different cities in support of the protests that were happening in upstate New York, 2-3 different cities at different times. And one of the largest crowds that we witnessed was also, I think, the most peaceful crowd we witnessed. And I would credit that to clergy that came out in the crowd that night in a public capacity. And you heard people policing themselves saying things like, no, respect the ministers that are here, respect the ministers. And that made an impact on me. That was powerful. And I think it was a really good example of the way that the church can be involved in these kind of things. So anyways, to your question, this is the hardest question for me, because often these conversations, right, the devil is in the details. So just give a few qualifications at the outset. First, the proposal is like 100 pages long. It's available on the Tompkins County website. So I would encourage anyone to go read it themselves. I've only read it over the past few days, and it has a lot of different elements, right? So I obviously can't speak on much of any of it. Secondly, of course, right, I work in criminal justice, but I'm not an expert, and a lot of what this report is touching on are issues that are highly debated, and there's research to support it, and there's research to call it into question, right? So it's involving things that are very complicated. And then finally, I don't work for IPD. I have worked in Tompkins County for a short time on patrol, but I don't work for the Ithaca Police Department. And while the Ithaca Police Department is not the only one involved in this report, they are kind of center stage. A lot of the most significant changes involve them. For example, some of the most significant changes include it essentially creates a new organization, and the head of that organization is a civilian. And one of the most significant results is it involves, and I can't remember the names of each, but it involves essentially armed professionals and also like community service workers that would be trained in, I suppose, things like mental health and things like that, but would not be an armed presence. Now, briefly, I see promise in this approach. I mean, I do think law enforcement are doing too much. As the famous saying goes, right? If all you have is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail. I mean, obviously, roughly a quarter of those killed by law enforcement have mental illness. Now, some of these, right, are, put it this way, a mentally ill person who's shooting at you is still a mentally ill person who's shooting at you. So I don't know that all of these are avoided. And I'm not going to say simply by changing the structure of the department, you're going to be able to avoid all of these. These are problems that need to be dealt with at a more foundational level, right? Police in some ways is responding to a society that needs to figure out our stuff better, figure out a better way of doing justly. But even beyond a mental health issue, you know, when I was working patrol, I was frequently called to a home not far from Ithaca for those with severe learning disabilities. And they would call us there because, you know, one of the people got violent and they didn't want to put up with it. And by got violent, usually like they got smacked. I never witnessed an injury. And they would call police, right? Because we could just take them to the hospital, cart them off. And you had, and hopefully nothing I say is offensive to those in this community, but right, you have adults that in terms of functionality are operating at a level similar to my young children. You know, they don't understand much, but they have large bodies. And you're calling a cop there who's not well trained in how to deal with this population. Now, I think like I was always able to deal with them in a humane and respectful way and get them to the hospital, but it didn't always turn out that way. I knew sometimes that these people were manhandled essentially to get them to the hospital. And why? So the hospital could go, why are they being sent here? And send them right back to the home where they came from. and recycle. That's a major problem. Cops should not be involved in dealing with issues like that. We are not the people to go to a situation like that. So on the one hand, yes, I like a lot of what I see. Here's my concern, right? There's always a limited amount of funding. And where the devil is in the details is I want to ask things like, well, how big are the reductions going to be? One of the very, very hard things about this conversation, and feel free to push back against this, Chief Mel and Cal and anybody else, but these are the things that I wrestle with. On the one hand, I have deep questions about justice, like with some of the policing that you saw come out of New York City in the 90s. Stop and frisk, look, I mean, I tend to lean conservative in a lot of political issues. I don't know how any conservative could support stop and frisk. It's just extremely questionable constitutionally, let alone the racial, leaving aside the racially disparate impact. I just don't know how anyone could support that just from a constitutional perspective. But here's the flip side, right? In the 90s, you had murder rates in New York City over 2,000. And over the last decade, it's typically hovered around 300 or even under. Now, I can't say that's all because of the policing. It's heavily debated. But some of the aggressive policing, there's an argument to be made that it does contribute. Now, am I saying it's therefore just? No, I'm not. And as Christians, we need to seriously think about justice, right? I don't want the state to become tyrannical simply because it's more effective if it's tyrannical. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is when you reduce an armed force, I am worried that you not only can see an uptick of crime, but where there is also not consistent police practice across the country, you can also see a migration of crime. So for example, if Ithaca becomes a place where it becomes known for not having a heavy police presence, you could see a criminal population that then looks to come here because they feel that they can more safely, do black market kind of things. That's a complicated question, right? I mean, the drug war is largely to contribute to that. And there are a whole lot of things we need to do to change the way we handle the drug crisis in America. But until we take care of those root issues, I have concerns about the effect of just some of these policy changes we're making with policing. It seems like we're letting the cart get before the horse, perhaps, in some sense. I don't know how helpful that is, but that's just preliminary thoughts.
Yeah, and we appreciate you offering your preliminary thoughts. I'm not going to push back because I want to follow. I want to respect the small amount of time we have left to address questions from the audience. And these questions are being fed to me, so I'm going to multitask. I'm going to try to pay attention to the screen while I'm reading questions that are being sent to me from the Q&A. Here's the question. When Black women and men are killed by an officer, no one is held accountable. Example, no one will be charged in the killing of Breonna Taylor. The only charge was damage to a neighbor's property. Why can't we hold officers accountable and charge them? That's the first question. Chief Mel, do you want to take a shot at that?
Well, listen, law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights. Ooh, my. That's a whole topic, right? That was built in such a manner to protect law enforcement officers. And quite frankly, I will tell you, in my humble opinion, it gives far too much protection for your officers, your police officers. So many protection. I know in the state of Maryland, it's got one of the strongest, if not the strongest union in the country. And where I do know there needs to be some type of covering for law enforcement officers because they are putting themselves in such a place of jeopardy on a regular occasion, it does have to be relooked at. Right. And so like officers shouldn't have, some cases 10 days, 30 days before they even have to give a statement in a situation like Breonna's. Right. That gives you so much time to get a story together. Right. You certainly don't give that kind of caveat to a suspect or perp. Right. As soon as you catch them, you're going in the box and you're getting interrogated. Right. And so many things that are built into the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights almost says to the community and to police that want to be honest that we're special, right? Remember what I talked about Sir Robert Peel that said police are the community and the community or the public. That he said police are the public and the public is the community. They should be one and the same. That's where they come from. That's where they serve. It's interchangeable. But yet you put something like these incredible roadblocks that the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights put up. So you can't get to that officer. You're not saying you're part of the public. You're saying you're different. You're better than, right? I got way more power than you do. And so until you see something done, and it's going to take probably at least a statewide in your state act of God, right? Enough of your local leaders to say we need to do something with this. I know there's some attempts here in Maryland, but cops it's a strong union. They're going to push back, and they're probably these people that want to change the bills and dilute them down a little bit. They're not going to be able to do it. I don't think they are, but God. Now, I hope God is able to bless them and they dilute it down a little bit, because we have more police officers. And please let me preference this to everyone. There are far more good officers than there are bad, right? It's just that we're out there 24/7. We're in the limelight. And so when you see one or two or three cops do something bad, it is so highlighted, right? I used to get mad, Elijah. I used to get mad at the firemen all the time. And I got a lot of firemen who are friends because they always getting praised. Don't nobody hate them, right? But it's like, but they ain't riding through your neighborhood 24/7. They're not knocking on your door. They're not doing none of that stuff. Only time you see them is when they come to pull you out of a fire. So of course they're always the good guys. But at the end of the day, we have such amount of liability that we are faced with on a day-to-day basis. Someone thought it was wise to make sure that we had some type of rights, additional rights, that would meet those liabilities. And I just believe that those rights surpassed what the abilities or the liability was. And somehow we need to dial that back a little bit, because I will tell you, police officers don't go into policing and saying, I got a get out of jail pass or go past jail, whatever. I can do whatever I want to the public. That's not the thought process of a police. Most cops are going to make the right decision and do the right thing. And if they do screw up, it's really just that. They screw up. They didn't intend on doing that.
Just as we who worked to put together this panel tonight knew that there would be so many questions that there's just no way we're going to be able to get to all of them. Normally, I would give both panelists an opportunity to weigh in on the same question, but because we've got so many, we're going to move right along here. I do want to make a point that I don't want to weave into a question right now, because I want to take these panelists' questions. When we talk about officers coming in, most of them, wanting to do the right thing and get into a culture and so on and so forth. Several months ago, I read a very interesting article and did some further research on it, where inside the government, I don't know if it was the FBI or what federal agency, was warning that white supremacists were actively infiltrating police departments. And yet, I mean, I'm a fairly well-read person that stays on top of the news for the most part, but I don't remember having ever heard or read anything about that. And so to the extent that that is happening, what message is that sending and reinforcing in the minds of so many people that, well, okay, there may be a lot of good people coming in, but apparently in fairly recent years, perhaps there are also some folks coming in who are not so good and are apparently not finding much resistance to being able to get in. And so I just wanted to make that point, because this theme has come up a couple times about, good people coming in and things that happen once they're there. And certainly not to challenge or discount that at all, but just simply to make the point that the government, within the government itself, there were people clamoring, shouting this out, but apparently not a whole lot of attention was being paid to it. Elijah, I want to ask a question. This is from the audience as well. Changing the culture of a nation, a people group, an organization, etc., requires changing the worldview of that nation, people group, or organization. Worldview is the deeply held beliefs. So here's the question. What are the deeply held beliefs within the police fraternity?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah, so let me think about the question about deeply held beliefs, but actually I want to maybe contest the assumption a little bit. One of the ways that I've changed my thinking recently, I was raised on a lot of worldview talk. And the way a lot of Christians especially tend to think of it is worldview affects basically who we are and what we do. And I think obviously there's some truth by that. It is very shaping. But kind of what I've been suggesting is actually, I think our practices affect our worldview as much as our worldview affects our practices. right? That's why so much of our life is out of line with the things we profess to believe. And I'm not talking about just in ways of occasional sins, but entire ways of living in the world can be out of step with what we say we believe, right? I mean, read the book of Galatians about table fellowship, uniting of Jew and Gentile, and then look at our segregated churches. That's just a classic example of the way that our lives are out of step. And what I would suggest is actually practices that we inhabit that shape our, and this isn't me suggesting it, right? This is people like philosopher James K. Smith. So you can go look him up. But he argues that practices that we do, liturgies, if you will, right? These worshipful practices actually affect our heart, our loves, our desires, and the orientations of our life. So on paper, the reason I say this is because on paper, if you ask me what the principles of law enforcement are, I picked it up when I first became a cop, and I typically only wear it in the gym now because it's a thin blue line shirt, and I have actually reservations about the thin blue line now. But when I first became a cop, I very proudly wore it. But on the front of this shirt, it says integrity, honor, and courage, right? And I think that would be kind of the principles that law enforcement would hold themselves up to. And in some respect, it's true. Like, look, the shooting that happened today, right? You had a law enforcement officer run into a grocery store to save others and get shot, and he left behind 7 kids. That's incredible courage. That is incredible courage, and thank God for people like that. But what else do you have? What kind of practices deform us? Well, when I was at Academy, I remember Academy is basically 6 months of hell, right? And there is a purpose for, right? There's a purpose for stress, right? You want to see that somebody can take being degraded, can take some stress and not react in anger. There is a good training purpose for that. For a few weeks, maybe a couple months, like the military does it. They tear you down for 6 to 8 weeks, and then they start building you up. In my police academy, it was 6 months of this, to the point that there was no purpose except that, right, the people that were there, it was the way they've always done it, so they're going to keep doing it that way. So the result is, I remember one time, a guy who had recently come out of the military, and an instructor walks through and we're at attention in the hallway, and he lifts his leg and farts on this guy. And later in our room, he was furious. He was like, I'm a vet, I've served overseas, and you're going to come pass gas on me? You have so little respect. Now think about this. What does this do when you are taught for 6 months that people can be treated like toilets? Well, I can tell you some of the effect it has. If cops are going, this is at least pervasive in my agency, right? If you're going somewhere and there's a lot of dog poop in the yard and you step on it, you know what you do if you're annoyed with the people that you're going to their house? You wipe the crap all over the floor when you come in. And you say, serves them right, they're wasting my time. Well, it's not surprising. For 6 months, you are ingrained in a culture that habituates you to disrespect people, that you can be disrespected. And regardless of the worldview that is being told to you, those habits deeply form you. So that's my response.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, I'm going to read it verbatim, and maybe both of you can weigh in on this one. You mentioned transformational leadership as opposed to transactional leadership. The person posing the question says, I know this as adaptive leadership, a business model that adapts to the needs and culture of the time. With the sheriff model, how does the panel think a new model of leadership could be implemented? Would it take a grassroots movement or governmental change or both?
Yeah, I think it's going to take both. You know, the Baltimore police top cop used to be an appointed position by the state, so the governor. And quite a few decades ago, it became under the rule of the local authority, which became the mayor. But still on the books, it's still the authority of the governor, but everybody accepts that it is the mayor now that will pick the cop. And so, and most of these appointees are for the benefit of that governmental leader. You know, who's going to do my bidding, and I hate to say this, but a lot of these leaders across the country are nothing more than puppets. You know, they have barriers and they have boundaries that they can only go but so far. And when they go beyond those boundaries, they are bitten or they're terminated. And so The reason I like the sheriff model, the reason I brought up the sheriff model is because they're elected officials, right? So you literally are a servant of the people. The people voted you in. You don't do the job, the people vote you out. And that's the way it should be. You know, it shouldn't be a situation where there are cities across this country, they know they have a bad top cop, but they can't get rid of them because the government official says, that's my guy, that's my gal, and they're going to stay right there. And the only people that suffer is the entire community or pockets of the community that mean nothing to that governmental institution. And so for me, I think the model will work better because, number one, if you go to an electoral where you can vote a leader in, you can then ask questions as a community member, because they would have to campaign like everybody else and figure out, is this somebody who's just going to jump at the whim of everything? Or is this somebody who's long-term thinker and really wants to see our city, our town, our county really become transformed, and what's their plan? Because most top cops get in place, they ain't even got to give you a plan. It's between them and the governmental leader. That's my boy, that's my gal, I'm putting you in, you got it. Yeah. And then later on, the community says, what's your plan? And whether they give it to you or not, as long as they're pleasing their boss, they don't care what you think. Yeah. They don't care what you think. And so, unfortunately, because of the way we run this country, you know, and the way we keep our seats as elected officials is just by that. And I can tell you, as I look through Baltimore, there are pockets that are just underserved and over-policed because cops look at them, or they're instructed, or they're pushed into this mindset that they don't mean anything. They're non-contributors to society. They don't do anything for us. They don't vote. They're dirty. They're this, they're that, and they're another. And so, yeah, I think the sheriff model, that's why I brought it up, works a lot better. And I'm going to just go back to what Elijah said. Quite frankly, at the end of the day, that question before you had it, we know that there are lots of people who enter into the police department with, not lots, let me take that back, but there are enough, too many, that enter into a police force with alternative motives. I've seen white supremacists and not understanding what white supremacists until they came into the police department. But at the same time, I've seen black drug dealers infiltrate and get in the police department before we realized they were drug dealers. And so it both happens. The challenge is the white supremacists are often overlooked. It's almost like they made it home. But those blacks that came in corrupt, they're getting rid of. I just want to throw that in there.
And thank you for putting that in. Yes, sir. Elijah, any thoughts that you want to add? And then we're going to ask one final question. Time is just moving along here.
If I can, I'll pass on that one. Chief Bell is the expert on upper leadership, and I couldn't say anything like he did, so I'll leave it there.
All right. Okay. All right. Listen, so here's the final question. And for the audience, listen, you know, you posed some great questions. I want to honor the time commitments that we've asked these gentlemen for. And I know, and Sister Lisa Christian, who's executive director of Community Faith Partners, will be coming on in a little bit. I'm sure that the questions are being captured, and perhaps there will be a way to get them to our panelists, and then for CFP to publish or make available their responses. There were some wonderfully insightful questions, and we just simply could not get to all of them. The final one we're going to ask tonight is, how would you recommend the local church best help? Elijah, why don't you take a crack at that, sir?
Sure. I don't know in details, but I can speak in generalities, which is always easy. It's great speaking in generalities because it doesn't pin you down to anything. So when I was in Arizona, as I mentioned, I lived there for a few periods. The church that I was involved in, and actually the picture before I turned my video on was of my pastor at that church. And quite by accident, they ended up having a large ministry to the homeless population in Arizona. It was by accident because it simply started as a potluck that was opened up to the community. And some homeless started attending, until a number of years later, a few hundred people, and this was a small church, we were like 30 members, but a few hundred people were getting at least one meal a day, every day at the church. Now, look, I'm not going to say it was easy. It wasn't, and it was very consuming. And of those few hundred, I could think about half a dozen lives who are radically transformed by the gospel, such that they're not homeless today and they live a very different life. that I can say for sure. But the point is, the church got their hands messy and were able to affect change in a way that I just don't think any law enforcement even can. When law enforcement interacts with, I'll give you a story to illustrate. Before I became a cop, I managed a coffee shop. And this couple would regularly come in who I knew were addicted to drugs. And they actually, at one point, they were gone for a while because they were found with a child in the car and they were high on, I believe it was methamphetamines, right? And so then they got not only charged with the drug possession, but they also got charged with endangering the welfare of a child. They're there driving around with a child in the car and they're high. And I always had a great relationship with this person until one day when they come in and they find out I'm leaving. They said, "Oh, really? You got a new job? What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to police academy." And his jaw kind of dropped and he looked at me and he said, "Oh." And then after that, it was different. The reality is, and I recognize that it's partly the fault of the policing community. But even if we changed policing and we stopped calling it policing overnight, building relationships of trust with those who've been disenfranchised by the government and particularly by the police, I think is going to take a couple generations. And the church needs to do it. We have to stop outsourcing love, frankly, to the government. The church needs to get involved. So it's a very broad answer, but I don't know how it looks. People that are smarter and more industrious than me need to figure that out. But I'll get on board. So let me know.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Chief Mel, you get the final word on this, sir. How would you recommend the local church help?
Yeah, let me just add, there's 3 initiatives we did, and I think it would work in any jurisdiction. Number 1, you have to get the churches to come together and pray. Prayer is very important, right? We actually got to the point where, and it's got to be multicultural. If you got multiple churches, don't segregate yourself. Learn to cross those lines. We had Christians. I demanded it. Christians, rabbis, Muslims, imams, everybody coming together, and people, these faith-based leaders couldn't understand how I did that. That's the way God wanted it, okay? So build prayer altars and spheres of influence throughout your city, right? So education, right? Media, government, and just continuously pray into those. Some churches, some faith-based organizations will only do that. Number 2, another group might want to just collaboratively come together and build out services that the community needs. I've asked churches and faith-based organizations, listen, the recs are gone. The police athletic leagues are gone. You've got this huge church. How about using some of your space to be a safe haven for our young people to come 2-3 times a week, 1 time a week? Just open up your doors and maybe rotate around the churches or something like that. Some of the churches want to get involved in re-entry and mentoring these guys coming out of jail. You got to figure out what your community is in need of and then build the services, not around what you think is good. I want to sell some chicken dinners. I want to do a food pantry and ain't nobody hungry. Build out what you got to assess, do an assessment of your community, and then collectively, so it's not a strain on any one institution, build out those services and begin to really serve your community. And then the last thing we talked about is at the end of the day, help your local police department. You know, I know the mayor's got this proposal, and I actually think it's a good idea for that small town. 30,000. My district that I ran had 60,000. But I will say that help your police out. See if they'd be amenable to you coming alongside of them. Maybe becoming their chaplains, praying for them. And don't be just ceremonial. Just don't go to their graduations and their promotions. And when they get injured, be there for them on a regular occasion. My chaplains had to do 20 hours every month. They had to volunteer their time or they couldn't be a chaplain to serve that community. I used to say, get in a car with the police, get out. That means get out and connect with the community, and then come together and bring both sides together. But you can't do that unless you have relational equity. So if you got a pastor walking around and nobody knows who he is, until he builds up relational equity in the community, you can't use him, because the police need your relational equity. Because until we get an engaged presence, you're not going to reduce whatever you want to see in your community. And the last thing I'll say, I think what would be a great, and he may or may not be on this call tonight, will be great for Ithacum is to, we talked about this yesterday, Cal, with Lisa and Elijah. There's an organization out there called Love is the Answer. Walking While Black, Love is the Answer. He's got a phenomenal documentary about what's going on in this country and how to restore social justice. And it starts with love. And he's going into cities, AJ Ali, he's going to cities all over the country and bringing this hope this love piece back and helping cities find their way back. And I think you guys, you can just Google him. I think you would do so well to invite him in. So this has been great, Cal. Elijah, you're gonna have a long, great career ahead of you, my friend. I see you being at the top of the heap someday, if that's what you want to do. So keep on the path that you are. I can tell that you're a servant leader, and that's what this country needs more of: servant leaders who are transformational leaders. And my spirit touches and agrees with your spirit. So I'll keep you in my prayers, brother.
Well, thanks for blazing the way, Chief Mel. I have a lot of respect for you, the little bit that I've gotten to know you and heard you, and I appreciate you so much, you coming out and speaking with us tonight.
God bless you.
On those notes, as moderator, let me just say it's been my pleasure to host this event tonight, and just want to add my thanks to both of you, Chief Mel and Elijah. Just thank you all so much for coming on tonight. We can just tell by the volume of questions and engagement from the audience, although unfortunately we didn't get to all of them during this broadcast, but I believe that those will be prepared and sent to you all, and hopefully there'll be a way to disseminate the answers. I want to say to the listening audience that Chief Mel has given permission to have his email address shared. My understanding is that it might be in the chat box, but it is Change Agent MR, which I assume is for Melvin Russell. changeagentmr@gmail.com. And with that, again, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for being here tonight. And I want to introduce and bring on Ms. Lisa P. Christian, who's the Executive Director of Community Faith Partners, for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Cal. And thank you all, our listening audience, for joining us tonight. This has been a robust and a very candid discussion. And I would say that Elijah was absolutely correct when he said the devil is in the details. And so that is why we must come together with honest conversation and a willingness to listen to one another. I happen to believe that if we do that, and when we do that, we will make strides toward racial justice and ultimately racial reconciliation. Chief Mel stated, if we all do our part, we can fix any city in America. Think about that. That takes effort, courage, and commitment. So we at Community Faith Partners say thank you, Elijah, and thank you, Chief Mel, for imparting to us your insights and your wisdom. And I would propose to our audience that we continue this conversation in our own communities, wherever that may be. As just a reminder, an announcement, join us next month for our April Let's Talk Unity. We will feature our author Sheila Wise Rowe, who is the author of Healing Racial Trauma. You will not want to miss that. And once again, we at Community Faith Partners are so appreciative of our donors who make Let's Talk Unity possible. And we want to give a special shout out to Dermatology Associates of Ithaca and the Park Foundation, who have helped fund our racial justice initiative. And so thank you for joining us. And in the words of the Apostle Paul, may the God of peace be with you all. Have a good evening.
Let me add one other. I'm sorry, Lisa, to throw in the last word, but I see that Chief Mel has put in his correct email address, and apparently I had it wrong. It is changeagentmel@gmail.com. Change, CHANGE, agent, AGENTMEL@gmail.com. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
God bless you guys. Love you to life.
All right.
Thank you.